Watercolor is a delicate and very interesting painterly medium, and what better way to explore the potential of this painterly medium than through that of a landscape painting. In today's tutorial, we will be learning how to paint a very interesting landscape that looks at a variety of different features and ultimately how to represent them through the watercolor medium. Now that we know what is in store, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another video by artincontext.org, where we explore a variety of different art-related topics. And in today's tutorial, we will be looking at how to paint a watercolor landscape in a very simple and interesting way. So with that being said, let's get into it. Now, with watercolor landscapes and watercolor scenery, we are describing an environment through a series of color arrangements. And specifically with the watercolor medium, it is important to understand that the way it works is with water. So essentially, it is a process of layering colors and using water to kind of shape the scene. However, before we start to do that, we first want to kind of establish the scene through a drawing process. And this is where we will basically start to establish the scene through a pencil sketch, or a very light pencil sketch. Now, we will be drawing a very specific scene, and that specific scene can be kind of accessed through a link below, and we'll use this as a reference image to kind of guide our painting process. It's always good to kind of use a source image, especially when you're beginning with a landscape painting process with the watercolor medium. It's nice to kind of have something to refer back and forth to and assist you in your painting process. Now, as we begin sketching out our scene, it's always good to start with the horizon line, which gives us a good sense of how far out the dock should be from the bottom section of the page. So the horizon line does kind of establish the foreground and how exactly the dock will be placed within the ocean of our landscape. Now, the dock is quite a focal point in this particular scenario, and as we analyze a source image, we can see that the dock has a variety of different beams, including foundational beams that support it, as well as these safety beams that support a handrail. What we want to do is maintain the correct proportions, but we can also play around with how many aspects of the dock we want to represent. So we are working with a reference image, but the intention is not necessarily to perfectly represent these features within the scenario. We can kind of use them as guiding principles to form our own landscape painting. As long as we draw something interesting, and as long as the proportions are correct and kind of make sense within our painting, then we will be fine. What we can do is go back and forth between our source image and drawing and trying to encapsulate the shape and perspective of the dock until we are satisfied. So we don't necessarily need to represent these structures perfectly or any of the features in the source image perfectly, but we can use them to guide our landscape drawing process. Now, again, we want to make sure that there is something interesting to look at on the dock. So let us try to put in interesting features on the dock that can help to make it a feature within the painting, or at least an interesting focal point. Another important aspect is the reflection of the dock on the water, which we can start to actually draw in at this early stage. Now, make sure you take your time basically sketching out the scenario, making sure you're working through the entire landscape, establishing the horizon line, and making sure that you're working in this feature. Again, this landscape is kind of emphasizing this very specific focal point, which is this dock. So spending time on the dock and this pier that runs through the water and kind of forms from the foreground into the midground, we do want to make sure we are working with a ruler and a pencil, and also an eraser, making sure that we are tweaking and kind of shaping this feature and making it kind of realistically placed within our landscape. So once again, it's really important that with watercolor landscapes, that we are not necessarily just trying to paint it from the get-go, but that we are kind of working with a light general sketch of the scenario that we are trying to paint, and those marks are basically going to guide us and assist us within our painting process. Now, once we have completed that, we're going to start by wetting the page, and this is where we move on to actually making some painterly marks. Here is where we prepare the surface of the paper by wetting the whole page with a thin layer of water the entire surface area of the paper. So what we can do is we can take a large brush that isn't loaded with paint, that is clean, and we can start making these back and forth or side to side actions that basically wet or coat the entire surface area of the paper with some water. Now with watercolor, what we do want to do is we want to start thinking already about the features that we are trying to represent, and this is where we actually start to think about them in tonal values. What is meant by this is that we're going to start this layering effect that ultimately we build up until we have created a quality of depth and three-dimensionality within our painting. So we're going to start by painting the background and the water within the landscape, as these are two main aspects or two large aspects of our landscape painting. Now this is where we already want to start thinking about the sunset aspect and color variation and how to represent this within our painting. So we want to work quite swiftly whilst the surface of the paper is wet, and the idea is to basically create this transition from the horizon line towards the top of the page that's going to establish the sky or the color scheme within the sky. And the idea is to kind of create this transition from these yellows and oranges to these darker colors of blues and maybe some purples. And this is again going to represent this quality of a sun that is kind of shifting behind the horizon line, and as it does so, it starts to dissipate, which inevitably allows the sky to move from this yellowy color to this blue and ultimately purple color that moves towards the top of the page. So the idea is to kind of work maybe with two brushes, where you first establish these strokes of yellow and then slowly start to transition from that into these colors of blues and then ultimately into these colors of purple. The idea is that it's going to create this seamless transition as the page kind of dries together. Those colors will collectively dry and ultimately create this very seamless transitions from yellow to blue within our sky. Now remember, water is a glassy surface which basically reflects its surrounding environment, and this is the case for the sky. So the idea is that we want to basically represent the same kind of color values in the water as we do within the sky. Now we do want to make sure, again, we're working whilst the paper is still wet, so remember to keep the brush fairly wet as you create these strokes within your water and sky scenes. Now again, naturally the intention here is to kind of create this base layer where the sky is kind of reflected on the surface of the water. So you do want to kind of understand how the sky is going to be colored, and then naturally you kind of want to represent that quality on the surface area of the water. And again, what we're doing with watercolor is we're kind of creating these layers of colors which we build on top of. So we do want to make sure that the horizon line also establishes this middle point between the reflective quality of the sky and the water as well. So make sure you take your time establishing this base layer where you basically work the colors into the sky, and then you kind of emulate those qualities into the surface of the water. And then once you have done that, you can allow that to completely dry, and this is where we can start to integrate a little bit more mid-tone qualities into our watercolor landscape. Now we do want to make sure we keep our page wet during this process, as it will set up a good foundation to paint over during the rest of this painting process. So we want to act fast while the page is still wet. So another good idea during this stage is to pre-mix your colors so that the paints are all ready for use. Now again, make sure you spend some time on the sky. Again, you also want to think about naturally how a sunset creates these transitions between these really bright moments and these orange moments, and then ultimately how that dissipates into these softer blues and then eventually into these darker blues. And then we can kind of emulate that process near the surface of the water that kind of connects to the horizon line, and that way we can kind of mimic that quality in the sky to create this effect of a reflection on the surface of the water. So now that we've kind of established these base layers, we want to basically focus more on the water, and this is where while the background is still drying, we can kind of start to create these ripple effects in the water. And the intention with creating these ripple effects is, for one, we want to think about depth. So the natural progression would be that the strokes become slightly thinner as they move towards the horizon line, which is kind of established to be at the background or in the background. So the idea is that as you kind of make these strokes back and forth, you want to think of them as these zigzag motions of making a painterly mark, and in doing so with some darker blues or some lighter to darker blues, because again we'll build up these color values from light to dark, we will find that the zigzag motion of making these brush strokes will eventually achieve this quality of ripples within the water. Now we really want to be cautious with this. We do want to think of them more as blobs to create these more thicker strokes or ripple qualities, and then obviously naturally we can kind of make them a little bit more closely compact lines or zigzag motions as we shift towards the horizon line. Now naturally it also will affect the shadow quality of the dock that is kind of being reflected on the surface of the water. So we can begin again by mixing our blues until we arrive to this darker turquoise blue, and we can do this by adding slightly more blue into a mix of blue, green, and think of it more as like a 70 to 30% ratio between blue and green. So naturally what we do want to do is we want to think about the color we are painting our ocean, and by nature of that we want to make the shadow that is cast by the dock or the reflection of the dock beneath it, we want to make that color consistently slightly darker to kind of have this accurate representation of a shadow on the surface of the water beneath the dock or the pier that sits above the water. Now allow yourself to not focus too much on even tone. If there is variation in the color of the reflection, that is also okay. This gives the painting a little bit more nuance and allows it to seem a little more painterly than drawn. So there are these qualities with watercolor painting that will naturally affect the ultimate outcome, and that's okay. I guess that's the point or the difference between watercolor painting and say something like oil painting. The next thing we want to do once we've established these features of the sky and especially the water, and make sure you spend time on the water. You really want to make sure that you're spending time on creating these zigzag motions to represent the ripples in the water, and then as you come to the foreground you really want to make sure you spend time on enlarging those zigzag motions, building up your color values from lighter blues to darker blues, and then ultimately darkening the shadow that is reflected on the surface of the water beneath the dock. And once you have done that and you've allowed it to dry completely, we can now move on to painting the dock. Now again, the way in which we can proceed with this painting process is really a subjective decision in terms of color and what kind of colors we want represented. But in terms of keeping a naturalistic color palettes, we can kind of work with browns and yellows to create this wooden quality within the dock and kind of give it this quality of how light kind of reflects off of these wooden features to kind of illuminate it slightly and give it this yellow tinge. Now again, the same process with building up these lighter layers with the dock is the same as we've done for the other surrounding features, and the intention here is to build up the dock with these lighter layers, and then once that has dried you can slowly start to work on these darker layers and then ultimately work in some refined darker line work and painterly marks to provide texture and some darker shadow formations. So take your time working on the dock, building up these colors, and a good suggestion is to kind of work on a variety of different features within your painting whilst other features are drying. So for instance, what we did earlier on is we worked on the water whilst the sky was drying, but we can do so with the dock and the shadow that reflects on the surface of the water beneath the dock. So while the dock is drying, let us take a moment to refine the reflection of the dock by mixing a tone of deep turquoise again, and then with a fine tip brush begin to make slight squiggle marks moving along the outline of that reflection beneath the dock. And again, this just gives it a more realistic representation of how the surface area of the water has ripples, and therefore the shadow itself will have this rippled quality. So we want to kind of work back and forth between features that are drying and wet, and making sure that we don't necessarily smudge over them, but we do want to kind of multitask in terms of working on a variety of features throughout our painting process, and this way we also save some time. Now coming back to the dock, if you still have a mix of yellow and brown, put a touch of red into it to darken it. This is another way to give it a more warm quality, and again we will use this for the edging of the pier of the dock and other features, just to kind of keep this color value and this spectrum of browns, yellows and reds kind of consistent within the dock. So naturally the same process applies, and you can be quite playful with it, but what we are doing is we are building up these lighter tones and then slowly darkening darkening them, and that's where we can shift from these yellows to these reds and ultimately browns and blacks for more finer details as we give the dock a little bit more detail and texture. We can use this warmer oaky red color to also create wooden lines on the pier, and we do this by taking our finest brush and carefully making these little swift strokes along the plane of our pier. And this means we can work on all of these little wooden planks that run along the pier and slowly integrating these marks. Always consider the depth of field as you make marks. So again, we also want to think about how the mark style and scale of our marks change according to how close they are in the foreground and how far they are towards the background. Now feel free to make any kind of marks on the dock with this darker color, and allow yourself to be creative and see how the darker color could develop contrast in the image that ultimately could enhance it slightly more or add value. And this is where we think about texture, surface areas, and how to use these darker marks as a means of creating also shadows, and ultimately just giving more nuance to our painting. Now, another part of this painting we're going to move towards is painting the horizon. In this tutorial, what we will do is kind of paint a cityscape, and this is just an interesting way to give our kind of landscape a very unique and interesting look. So what we can do is we can mix a darker blue with a touch of black to get a deep blue that almost resembles black maybe. Again, we don't necessarily need to always use black, but we can kind of darken our other colors and ultimately work with an interesting color variation. So our color choices is really up to us, and that is a subjective process. But what we are doing here is we're just giving a little bit more detail and something interesting to the horizon line, just to provide another feature to our landscape. With landscape watercolor paintings, it's really a matter of visuals and aesthetics and kind of how to build up our landscapes. So working with more features ultimately just gives it a more interesting look. Now we want to use a dark blue and slowly and steady create this very seamless kind of representation of a skyline along the horizon line. You can also kind of allow this cityscape or the skyline to kind of drift towards a more mountainy quality. And again, when it comes to landscapes, especially with features in the distance, they slightly or they become slightly abstract, and this is because when we see things from a distance they kind of distort a little bit. So what we can do is we can get away with a lot of very vague mark making processes where basically we kind of creating the illusion or the effect or a suggestion of a skyline. And by nature of that, what this will do is it will not only enhance the painting, but it will give it this realistic quality of a skyline in the distance. From there, what we can do is we can work this quality across the entire horizon line, and this is where we can keep a skyline predominantly to the left side and then slowly allow it to merge into maybe a softer mountainscape towards the right of our painting. What we can also do is add these little dots of white along our skyline to give this impression of lights within the night skyline. And then what we can also do is kind of create this softer reflection in the water beneath the skyline that kind of again reflects or mirrors the skyline that sits on top of the horizon line. So naturally, again, these qualities are quite vague when seen from a distance, but if we kind of capture these fundamental features that kind of represent a realistic quality, such as a reflection within the water or these little white dots that represent lights within the skyline, we will find that it does enough to have this accurate representation of actual features in the real world. Now, again, what we can do is we can take our time on these different features, making sure that we go back and forth, spending time on features that sit in the foreground, spending time on the water, and ultimately adding more detailing to the features in the background, such as the skyline and whatever sits on the horizon line. Now, at this point, we should have a painting that could be considered finished. However, a great suggestion is to always add in little details, again, to ultimately enhance the painting once you have finished the most important part. For instance, little marks do bring out like the wood in the pier, so adding these little textures in the pier or along the planks within the pier is a great way to kind of give the pier a little more texture, and ultimately it is a feature that sits in the foreground, so it's a focal point to kind of spend some time on. But the same goes for all the features, including the skyline or the details that sit in the background. But ultimately at this point what we are doing is we are simply going through our entire painting, and also knowing when to stop is also important. We don't necessarily need to overly paint our painting. Sometimes features do need less than they need more, and that is another thing to consider as you slowly develop your landscape painting. But otherwise guys, this is a general process of how to approach a watercolor landscape painting. Again, with watercolor, the intention is to always build up from layers, and when you're working with a landscape, what you're doing is you are developing something from the background to the foreground. So you always want to establish these lighter qualities and tonal values from the background, then you can slowly start to build up these features with some more details, and that's where we start to integrate some darker tonal values. And then ultimately what we can do is we can start to really emphasize features by adding more specific painterly marks, being a little bit more strategic with our brush sizes, and how to ultimately emulate very specific effects and features within our landscape painting. And that is where we start focusing on things such as water and how to create these horizontal squiggly marks, or how to integrate some line work and refine painterly marks into something like a pier or a dock to represent that quality of wood, and so on and so on. And then the other thing is thinking about your color values. Ultimately, the colors that you choose will have an overall effect and kind of evoke a particular kind of feeling within your painting. So thinking about your color choices is again a subjective thing, and you can play around with it. We don't necessarily need to stick to conventional color schemes, but we do want to think about how naturalistic elements such as light and water are represented in the real world, and then how do we draw inspiration from that to kind of recreate it or emulate it within our own painting process. But otherwise guys, I hope this video was interesting. I hope it was helpful. I hope you gained some knowledge on some key ideas and watercolor painting processes that are associated with the watercolor medium. If you're interested in related topics, please let us know in the comment section below. If you did like the video, please drop a like, please subscribe. That helps us to grow the channel, and ultimately that enables us to make more art related content for you guys. But otherwise, thanks again for tuning in. That's it from me today. I'll see you next time. Until then, cheers.